was it that I just needed to do? Oh. Showing up. Okay, that. then where is it? Come on.
The host isn't there or something.
There, hold on. There's some. Okay, so you roll that out.
Okay, we'll. Okay, good morning, everybody. I think that we'll actually start on time. Start on time today. This is the share on emerging technologies, dealing specifically with Zoom. It's going to be primarily a halachic share, and we'll do sources inside. We're going to at least do a series of Tshuvot Rav Moshe that I wrote about last week. I want to do them in depth, and if we have time, we'll get to some of the recent conversations about Zoom Minyanim. And I hope that some of the theoretical ideas will be picked up as well in the Motzei Shabbat shir, Halachic Man Enters the Matrix. All right, so we have remaining is a 9 p.m. shir tonight on how parentheses can Halacha change, and the Friday morning shir on Shabbos thickness, and the Motzei Shabbat shir on Halachic Man Enters the Matrix. Thank you. And we're going to. I hope to have a schedule for next week sometime soon. I'm hoping that we'll address issues associated with the labor ethics. The challenge is that, but just have to make sure I can prepare enough to pull it off. So I hope that the share will be. I hope that the schedule will be out tomorrow. Okay. So today, I'm going to share the source sheet now. Okay. What I want to, I guess, begin by saying is that there are dramatic differences between the question of CRISPR, which we talked about yesterday, and Zoom. In that CRISPR, we're dealing with issues about human power, and we have capacities that matter a great deal in the world that force us to think about ethics and issues like that anew. Whereas Zoom is in large measure a reflection of the general challenges created by electrical technology and the capacity for reproduction. It does raise issues in terms of community and issues like that, but fundamentally the challenges are extensions of existing capacities. And it's really not so hard, as opposed to CRISPR, it's not so hard to find precedents or to make analogies. But the real issue is that Halakhah as a whole, I think we've done, in many ways, done an amazing job in dealing with bioethics challenges, even if I think that many of the immediate responses were excellent but not necessarily correct, and may need to be rethought dramatically. But we really, I think, did I think Rabbi Bleich, Rabbi Tendler, Rabbi Jacobowitz, right? There's a whole group of halachists who deserve enormous credit for creating Halakhah from scratch in response to a radically new field, and convincingly creating something that looks like Halakhah. Whereas in terms of electricity, we have in large measure just failed. Halakhah has still not really accounted for the capacities of electrical technology. And so Zoom, we'll see, is largely a function of the challenges of Zoom in many ways are a function of our failures to deal with it in the past. So you'll see, we'll see how the approach is mentioned. Like we're not going to use natural law approaches for Zoom, right? Huge types of approaches, and I think mostly we're not even going to use huge sweeping shifts. Really, just the question is how much of halacha just technical halacha can we create an area where the precedents can only be extended by an analogy, and the differences are obvious. Okay, let's take a look. So we're going to start with Mishnah Rosh Hashanah. And Mishnah Rosh Hashanah says, "Hatokeh l'toch habor," if you blow shofar into a pit, or l'toch hadut, which is some kind of ground-based thing with walls, or l'toch hapitim, or some kind of giant pottery item. Im kol shofar shema yatsa. If you hear the call of the shofar, you're yotze. Im kol havara shema. But if you hear something called the kol havara, which I'd rather not define, lo yatsa, right? Then you have not fulfilled your obligation. Okay, Lechet Shlomo and Rosh Hashanah offers a summary of the two fundamental positions about halacha of this Mishnah. So the Rush says, you said if I hear a kol shofar I'm yotze, and I hear a kol havara I'm not yotze. Well, how do I know whether I heard a kol shofar or a kol havara? And he says, "V'lo mistaber shetahei talui behavchanat ha'adam." Right? It doesn't make sense to him that it should be dependent on human perception, whether it is a kol shofar or a kol havara, right? Because that really should really you tell me that that you have to listen because sometimes the sound coming out of the pit is the shofar and sometimes the havara. That should be a technical thing, right? So I think so he thinks that the right explanation, the right explanation is that is that if you hear and this is based on the Gemara, we're not going to talk about the interpretation of the Gemara. Achi Pirusho, when they said that if you hear the kol havara that you're not yotze, that's talking about those people on the edge of the pit, outside the pit. Shakol misbalbel b'bor kodem sheyatzalachus. They're never yotze. V'lo'olam einan shomim ela kol havara. They're never yotze. They only hear the kol havara. Okay, so the Rush says we're not going to leave it up to human determination to decide whether it's a kol havara or not. We're going to tell you that it depends on where you're standing. Whereas the Beis Yosef says, "Lo yadati ma avchana yeshim kol shofar shema kol havara." That's what the Rush wrote. The Beis Yosef writes, "Nireh shekol adam yachol havchin." It seems to me that anybody can hear the difference. Okay, so what's the fundamental argument between the Beis Yosef and the Rush? So I want to contend that probably they reflect a basic question, which is, what's the problem with the kol havara? So one possibility is that the kol havara is not the kol shofar; it just isn't. Right? And the issue is, what is it? Or what is it? And the other possibility is that it's not a kol shofar because it doesn't sound like one; it's been altered. Right? And so, really, right, in one position, as long as it sounds like the shofar, we don't really care what produced it. And in the other position, what matters to us is whether it sounds like the shofar. Okay, right now you could deny this and you could say no. As long as it sounds like the shofar, we know that it is the shofar. But that seems implausible because you're blowing into a pit, so you know there are going to be echoes. Right. So the question is really going to be, right? Some people say that I think the easiest way of understanding it is some people think an echo is kosher as long as it's a clear echo, and some people say that the issue is whether it's an echo or not. If you define it by where you are, it's a question defined of whether it's an echo or not. And if you define it, and if you think you can hear the difference, then it's a function of whether it sounds like a shofar. Okay, let's see how Rav Moshe Feinstein applied this to the modern question of electronic amplification. Like electronic amplification, you could say is just an echo, and and you could imagine a mechanical megaphone, which is just a way of like an ear trumpet, right? It's just a way of causing the same sound waves to reverberate. But really, you have electricity, which seems to involve some kind of transformation of your voice into some other medium, and then you can decide how sophisticated you have to be. And that's one of the issues we have to address: is how good an idea is it for halacha to be based on technological expertise. So Rav Moshe says the following. This is his first tshuva, and this is undated, but we know from the next tshuva that it must be sometime before 1950, I believe. So, Bekriyas HaMegillah al Yidei microphone. What about reading the Megillah? Right? It's before the next tshuva. That's all we know right now. Bekriyas HaMegillah al Yidei microphone to his friend Rabbi Chaim Dovber Ginsburg. He says the following: microphone. It's very difficult to say clear halacha about this. Here Rav Moshe raises a bunch of really important issues. So first of all, he says, I don't want to say clear halacha because not everything is clear yet. So that's the idea that an issue is not yet ripe for judgment is a really important idea that I think is not sufficiently considered in Halakhah. Maybe there are issues that we just can't decide yet. And then, right, then you have secondary challenge. What do we do until we decide it? So some people will say, well, let's be machmer on the deraisas and makil on the rabbanans. And some people will say, let's be machmer on everything. And some people will say, let's be makil on everything. We saw those attitudes yesterday with regard to CRISPR, right? If there's no isser, it's mutter, right? That was the quote from Tiferes Yisrael, or an assumption that you really, really need to be cautious. Okay. Now, but why is it not clear? He says it hasn't been made clear yet. Eich nishma al yedei zeh, right? How a microphone makes you hear things. Al yedei anashim harui lismoch alehem, right? Via people whom it is proper to rely on. Okay, there's been what I consider to be a clear mistranslation of this. I'm going to state again that anashim harui lismoch alehem, I think clearly means by people who it is appropriate to rely on. So now the question is, what's your standard for people who it's appropriate to rely on? So you often have people saying that halachis should just rely on experts, but in an emerging field, the consensus is not necessarily initially correct. And I always argue that non-Orthodox poskim dafka have an obligation to actually investigate the issue themselves and try and understand it, as opposed to simply relying on experts. And I think that many times halakha has been made incorrectly and even in ways that appear retrospectively ridiculous, because people just accepted either a scientific consensus, or more often what happens is you don't know, right? You have no direct access to a scientific consensus. So what you do is you either read a popular version of it, or more likely, what many posts can do is they have one expert they trust, and that often leads them into error. So I think Rav Moshe's caution here is beautiful, right? He says, look, I haven't found anybody I really trust. I would much prefer if he hadn't found in the end one person he trusted, but had access to an array of people with different perspectives. But so for now, he says, I can't say real halakha because I don't really know what the situation is. And the challenge then is, if you don't know, right? What are you supposed to say then, right? Somebody's asking you the question. What are we supposed to do? So he says, right? Therefore, his first reaction is, microphone. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. And he says, I don't think anyone ever asked me the question yet. Right, and you told me, it says, somebody says, I said, leave them be. I never said that. Okay, I never said that. Doesn't mean he's not going to say it now. What he's saying is, if you were to ask me the question, I would say we don't have a clear halacha. And his attitude is, look, you're trying to be yotzei mitzvah, you don't have a clear halacha, so why would you do it the other way? The counter is going to be, but maybe there are places where people won't be yotzei anyway because they can't hear. Maybe there are people who have poor hearing, right? So they're never yotzei unless you allow microphones. There aren't miniature hearing aids yet. I don't even know if there are electronic ear trumpets, but perhaps Rav Moshe sees this issue coming. Okay, so now but he doesn't leave it at that, because the person who wrote in the question did not just ask him his opinion, but actually wrote his own opinion or expressed his own opinion. So he says, what you find obvious, microphone, right? He said, you thought the answer was obvious, right? So obviously, what happened, it seems, is Rabbi Ginsburg came to Rav Moshe and said, that young rabbi over there told me that you said that if people want to use a microphone, I'm not going to endorse it, but let it be. I said to Rav Moshe, I never said that, but your position that it's obvious that your position that it's obvious that we should be able to that they're not yotzei, that position is also not obvious to me. Okay, so Rav Moshe says, I apologize. I'm just going to stop for a sec because there's a chat question that I, for some reason, was failing to see. Right. Okay. Yes. Okay. We'll go back to sharing. I apologize. I didn't do that well. Okay. So now Rav Moshe says, you think it's obvious or not yotzei? Mitam shu kimoshu shomea me'enu bar chiyuva. Okay. So Rabbi Ginsburg said it's obvious to me that you can't be yotzei with a microphone, because you're not hearing the person reading the Megillah. What you're hearing is the microphone. And in order to be Yotze the Megillah, the voice you're hearing has to come from somebody who is themselves under the subject to the obligation of reading Megillah, and the microphone is the machine. Okay, right? He said, now what's your basis? According to the experts, right? So be clear, Rav Moshe knows they're experts. He's consulted them. He just doesn't have somebody whom he's willing to rely on absolutely. So the experts say, the microphone doesn't actually reproduce the voice. It just produces something called a had havara, which is very difficult to translate. Right. So Rabbi Ginsburg said, whatever the voice produced by the microphone is not the voice of the reader, and therefore obviously you're not Yotzei for the technical reason that you're not hearing the Megillah from somebody who is Chayav. But so Rav Moshe says, I think that your use of terminology is inappropriate. Lo dak vod terasa l'shono. The ain shayach, because you use the word kol havara to refer to Eino Baruch Yuva. Rav Moshe says, I don't understand the Gemara Rosh Hashanah that way. I understand the Gemara Rosh Hashanah to mean that a kol havara is a distorted kol. Okay, right? But here he says, what happens is a kol chazaku bari. Here, the voice the microphone reproduces is an undistorted, clear voice. So Rav Moshe says the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah doesn't tell me anything about the source of the voice. The Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, as Rav Moshe understands it, is that there is an obvious difference between the voice, between the original sound of the shofar and the sound produced by the echo, and the sound produced by the echo is weaker or distorted, and that's why you're not Yotzei. The Mishnah Rosh Hashanah tells me nothing about what would happen with a perfect echo. And the simplest reading is that a perfect echo would, according to Rav Moshe, you would be Yotzei with. And that's really important, right, by the way, because if you have a contemporary scientific understanding, you understand that the sound you hear in a space is always going to be affected by echoes. And the sound is bouncing off the walls, and in fact, the whole science of acoustics is designed to make the sound bounce off the walls properly. And if all an echo is a sound bouncing off a wall, the Rav Moshe's position makes eminent sense. Why should you not be Yotzei within the echo of a shofar? Why is that different than hearing the shofar directly? The Rav Moshe says it must be the pshat in the Mishnah is that there's a distorted sound, which is really along the lines of the Beis Yosef, is that you can, if you can't tell the difference, then you're Yotzei. So now Rav Moshe says, your doubt that the microphone is different, that the microphone is right, the microphone, even if it is an excellent reproduction, you're not Yotzei. Right? It's not obvious to me that you're not Yotzei with an excellent reproduction. Even if you say the experts are right, that what a microphone does is not reproduce the voice. Instead, what the microphone does is that it produces another voice at the impetus of the original speaker's voice. Right? Since, right, why is it not obvious to me? Because it seems to me that this new voice is produced only at the time that the speaker is speaking, and therefore yesh lachashiv zeh kishmiat kol mamash. So you can hear this new voice can be considered the same as the original voice. Because everything that is heard is directly produced by your voice. All right. So here Rav Moshe has an original idea, which he doesn't really formulate well, and which we're still arguing about. Right. He says it's that this new sound is heard only when the koreh is speaking. So does that mean that he intends to ban a delay? And he's really and he's talking about the difference between a direct action and what we would call in other areas of Halakhah a grama. And one of the models of grama is is that a delay automatically reduces something from being your the direct result of your koach to being a grama, or is he creating some kind of new category of koach, which, right, if it turned out that this voice is wholly, right, this new sound is wholly produced by your sound, maybe that would be that would be enough, right? We also have really, a really interesting question about reading Megillah through voters and things like that, where it's your vocal cords that generate the production of the sound, but it's not actually the sound that you produce, right? A whole set of fascinating questions raised by Rav Moshe's formulation. Everything that is done, right? Here's the formulation that doesn't involve time. Everything is, right, it happens, it creates because of his voice. Uminayin lanu etzem koach hashmiya echu, right? And he says, and how do we really know what hearing is? Shulayu gamkein bofen. Maybe, right? Maybe he says, maybe sound happens like this. Shenivra eze davar be'avir u'magia li'azno. Something else is created in the air, and that intermediate thing that is created in the air reaches your ears. And that's what the scientists tell us. That a voice has duration, right? It has to move in space and time. Ad ozen, right, till the ear. Right? It takes a certain amount of time. So this is an utterly fascinating tshuva. He has a certain understanding, right? Somebody has clearly explained sound waves to him, but he seems to still have this notion that there's a Platonic idea of voice, and right, there's some kind of thing called a voice, and that thing called a voice is translated into sound waves, I guess. Not clear, but now he challenges the duration, the idea that even a delay should matter, because after all, he says sound waves are delayed also. So if the thing we call voice is not really, the intrinsic, I don't know, the Kantian noumena, whatever you want to call a voice, but rather what we call voice is a sound wave traveling in the air that has duration, and then it's translated by our ears and our brains into some kind of mental experience. So why should it matter whether whatever the thing we call voice is produces sound waves in the air, or produces electric waves, or for that matter produces electric waves that then produce sound waves? Right, so here Rav Moshe says your fundamental claim that we have to separate the electronic thing from the original, that is not obvious to me, because nobody ever said that it has to be the voice of the person defined in rigid physical terms. Now, I should say there's a misunderstanding here as well, is that some people think that Rav Moshe is distinguishing Megillah from shofar, because by shofar there is an idea that it has to be the sound of the shofar. But at this point, Rav Moshe isn't necessarily doing that. What he says is, right, as far as he's concerned, this would work for shofar too, as long as it was a perfect reproduction. He doesn't think there's any special din. Right, a special din is not obvious that the shofar is different than a person. Right, if it's the sound produced by the shofar, maybe that's enough, maybe not. I don't think that Rav Moshe is saying anything different yet. So he says, "L'chein efshar shegam hakol shenaseh b'microphone be'ez shemedaber sheshomim oto u'nechshav kolo mamash." Right, so maybe the sound coming out of the microphone is your voice. V'chein hayoter mistaber, and he thinks that if you were to ask him to choose, does it make more sense to say that the sound coming out of the microphone is your voice halachically, or does it make more sound to say that we attribute it to the impersonal machine? The answer is it makes more sense to him to say that this is your voice. Okay, and you can think about whether this is different than machine matzahs if you want, right? Because fundamentally, right? Okay, right. You can think about that. But now he says, okay, now right. So now that's Rav Moshe's analysis, and then he says, "V'gam lo berur hadavar ma shomrim shu kol acher." And secondly, he says, you know what? I know the experts say this, but it's not obvious to me that it's true. Right? So I think that this is, I encourage poskim to be skeptical of their own understanding and of what they're told by particular experts, and even of the consensus in an emerging field. Rav Moshe is not convinced. So, right, first of all, he says, I'm not convinced scientifically that what you claim is true. It's a new voice. And also, even if I were convinced scientifically, I'm not convinced that you're right halachically. that that the voice is attributed to the machine and not to the person. He says, "Umitamze, efshar she'en limchot biyad elu sherotzim lekro Megillah al yedei microphone mitzad halacha." And he says, therefore, even though he began the tshuva by denying he'd ever said it before, now he says, right? He says, a lot of qualifiers. It's possible. It's possible we shouldn't object to those people who want to read Megillah by a microphone from pure halachic perspective. And he says, "V'kilkel mitzvahs acheros," right? If you're worried that there's going to be there's going to be a slippery slope, and people are going to use this for all other mitzvahs. Shul shofar kriyas haTorah b'Shabbos v'Yontiv. You're afraid that people are going to start blowing shofar and kriyas haTorah on Shabbos v'Yontiv. Yeshar levomi said that can't happen. The asur l'daber microphone b'Shabbos v'Yontiv, because he assumes as a given. Now, why he assumes this is not obvious, but probably he thinks it's hashmas kol, which is independent of the mechanism. Since you're not allowed to speak in the microphone, nobody's going to do this on Shabbos and Yantiv. With a mitzvahs dibur shebechol, and if you're going to talk about not about shofar and kriyas haTorah, right, but about mitzvahs that are accomplished by speech during the week, im gam ken you group a microphone, if they're going to read that microphone, hayim ein limchos b'Megillah, if you're not supposed to object to Megillah, kol shekain be'elu. Okay, but this is a very interesting thing, because why does he talk about kilkul for shofar and kriyas haTorah? No, that's not going to happen because it's Shabbos and Yantiv. He should say kilkul for shofar and kriyas haTorah, and kriyas haTorah happens on Monday and Thursday, by the way. The reason that the reason that there's no kilkul is because the same argument as in the second half. So it might be there's something different about shofar, even though he hasn't, and maybe even kriyas haTorah, even though he hasn't identified it. Okay, but now we get to Rav Moshe functioning as a posek. He says, "Ach mikol makom," but nonetheless, kivan shelo barur leheter, since it's not obvious that it's mutter, v'hu inyan chadash bichlal, and it's a wholly new matter. Yesh limchos kidei lemon'am milerdof acharei chadashot achirot. You should object on sociological grounds, because people like to go after new things. Shelahutim bazeh b'mdinos elu. There are people in this country or these countries love going after, trying new stuff. Kimosha Kosek Votarasa, right? As my friend wrote. Okay, so let's stop and summarize. Rav Moshe ends up with a very complex and nuanced position. He says that it seems to him that if he had to make a decision, that this works for Megillah, and it works for all other weekday speech blessings. There's some ambiguity about whether it works for shofar and kriyas haTorah. We don't know what the source of that is. But he says, you shouldn't rush to make decisions when the science isn't clear. Really, the right outcome, when you have a position that is based on new scientific understandings that you're not sure are right, and you're not sure even if they're right, you're speculating halachically, but you're not building yourself on clear precedent. The right thing to do is to tell people you shouldn't do it and not object if they do it anyway, because they might have good reasons for doing it anyway. Right? If that's the normal approach to new technology, Rav Moshe, is you gather the data, but it's not your obligation to make a decision. If people ask you, say better be cautious, and if people scream, say how do you know? But then he says, sometimes there are additional sociological factors which say that you should object, because the reason people are doing this is possibly not because they have really good reasons for doing so, but because some people like shiny new things. Some people are interested in change for the sake of change, and Rav Moshe isn't fond of what I would call early halachic adopters. People are rushing to say the world has changed, right? So I think that this is a very careful tshuva that I think is an excellent model for dealing with new technology as a whole, which is don't be confident you know the answer, don't be confident you understand the technology, and then but then once you've reached the patient, balanced halachic position, which is probably let it work it out. If there's a sociological reason to intervene, you can do that as well. Okay, that's the first tshuva. Let's go on now to the second and maybe the third, and then we'll take questions after them, assuming that we have time. And if not, questions can always be emailed. Okay, here's the second tshuva of Moshe. We know it's later because he refers to the earlier one. He says, "Binyan shmiat havdalah al telephone lisha nitseit beveit cholim." For in terms of hearing havdalah by telephone, and it's not what a telephone is. Is a telephone a microphone? Is a telephone a hearing aid? Not at all clear. For a woman who is in the hospital, hine im sharla shetishma havdalah b'mkoma. If she can't hear havdalah where she is, v'day yesh lishma ala telephone. She should certainly hear it on the telephone. Sheyoter notesh yotz abazeh. It seems more likely, saying right, that she's yotze havdalah than not by telephone. Kidikasafti b'tshuva, as I wrote in my last tshuva. Huadin gabi havdalah, and just like I said about Megillah, I say it about havdalah, and here she has no choice. So my claiming you shouldn't do it makes no sense. So right, when you're not sure what to do and people have no choice, then obviously you should tell them to do it. Mishum dechol mitzvahs dibur bechol hukum Megillah, because there's no difference between any of the mitzvot of speech during the week and Megillah. Okay, I'm going to skip a line now. It says shelachein kivan she'efshel lishmo havdalah b'veit cholim. Since she can't hear havdalah in the hospital, tzricha lishmo l'idei telephone. She has to hear it by telephone. V'chein tzarich lanot amen al bracha sheshomin al idei telephone al idei microphone misafik. And Rav Moshe said you also have to answer amen to a bracha that you hear on the telephone. Let's assume that it's live, right? That he's not dealing with a recording issue, and he also isn't dealing with radio, which may or may not be the same thing. And I don't know if he knows yet about 7-second delays and the like. You have to answer amen on a bracha misafik. Okay, so Rav Moshe has a very consistent position, I think it is, which is that you can't, right, when dealing with a new technology, and I seem to have cut out the date on this tshuva, but I think it's, I think this is, let's see when the next one is. The next one's Tashin Mem. So I think, yeah, this one is in 5712. So we're in 1952 probably. So Rav Moshe says it's a suffix. What happens in a suffix is you tell people not to do it. You don't object if they do it, and if someone has no other choice, you tell them to do it. Okay. Now, what I do want to say though is that there are people who are arguing that Rav Moshe really thinks that that the microphone definitely works, and he's just refraining from endorsing it for sociological reasons. And they say, look, this tshuva disambiguates. So this tshuva doesn't disambiguate because he says it's misafik, but actually there's a better proof that Rav Moshe is not making up his mind here. Because the line I skipped is Levad, right? He says all mitzvahs of speech during the week are like Megillah, except for Kriyat Shema and Birkat Hamazon. Because by Kriyat Shema and Birkat Hamazon, he says shetzarich limchot be'elu haratzim l'tzeit b'microphone. If somebody wants to be yotze benching over a microphone, or he wants to be yotze Kriyat Shema over a microphone, then Rav Moshe all of a sudden says you have to object. So what's different, right? He doesn't say, right? So whatever it is, it's not something that's unique to shofar, and din of kol shofar, because he says the things you have to object to are Kriyat Shema and benching. So the answer, it seems to me clear, and I haven't heard an alternative response, is that Kriyat Shema and Birkat Hamazon are d'oraita. And if somebody engages in something, but if you have a situation where somebody is trying to be yotze a mitzvah d'oraita misafek, and they have some kind of alternative, then you object to it. Why are you trying to do it by a suffix way as opposed to a vade way? Now, tell me, what about Havdalah? The answer is, even if you read the Havdalah can be d'oraita, but the woman, right? But you can say Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, and presumably the woman, right, before he told her to pick up a telephone, he would have told her, right, to say Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh l'chol. You don't need anybody for that. It's a woman who wants to hear Havdalah with all the brachos from somebody else, maybe because she holds right, a wild position that women can't make Havdalah for themselves, or maybe because she just doesn't know how to do it herself, or maybe because you can't bring candles into a hospital, whatever it may be. So the Havdalah here we're talking about is clearly only Havdalah d'Rabbanan, not Havdalah d'Oraita, and therefore Rav Moshe has a wholly consistent position here, which is that dealing with a new technology, even if you have what he thinks is a strong, a predilection, right? He makes a decision, right? He thinks is more likely than not but that isn't enough to remove him from the category of suffix, and isn't even enough to stop him from objecting to people who try and fulfill this dioraita. But but he doesn't want that kind of caution to prevent people from being yotze when they have no choice. So he lets the woman hear it over the telephone, but he'll probably say that even though he tells the woman to hear it over the that she can hear it over the telephone, and apart from objecting, he's still going to object to people who do it lechatchila, even for Megillah, because he thinks that it's bad public policy to let this happen without objection. Okay, that'll bring us to the third tshuva, which for some reason was missing from several initial treatments of this subject. The third tshuva, which is in Tafshin Mem, right? So now we're in 1980, is written to Rabbi Raphael Binyamin Posen, who is the general principal of the I think is a girls' school called Benot Kfar Elio in Israel, and he sends him nice greetings, and then he says the following. He says, in the upcoming Purim, your shul is not big enough. The Beit Knesset of your school is not big enough to have 2 minyanim. So we derive that the past custom of the past custom of the school was to divide into 2 minyanim and have 2 people, right, and have a minyan each place, and the girls would divide in half, and that way all the girls could hear the Megillah. But he says the Chol tell me, right, but now that there isn't space for 2 minyanim, the Chol tell me and the way your synagogue is set up, if you bring all the girls into the Beit Knesset at the same time, the only way some of them can hear is by microphone. Okay, I don't know what happens on a regular Shabbos, but maybe it's not so crowded, or whatever it may be, so that they're not so bothered. So maybe I should allow you to read the Megillah by microphone for the girls. Because it seems more likely than not that they fulfill their mitzvah. But he says, I should have made this a new line, and this should really be the end of the line, right? You saw in my tshuva that I said this, but since it's not obvious that this is clear, and also, right, separate issue, it's also something new, and we don't like encouraging people to engage in halachic experimentation or religious experimentation ritually. He thinks, Ein lasod kein, you shouldn't do it. That is an interesting line. But he'll tell me it's a shasat chak. What are we supposed to do? So why is it a shasat chak? There isn't enough space in the shul. He says, right? He says, guess what? Ein lasod kein ladati. I think your chak is not enough. Why? The Yoter Tov, right? So what turned out is that Purim is on Sunday, and their ordinary practice was that they would clear the cafeteria for the second minyan. But now it's Shabbos and they can't prepare. There's a better habit is Yoter Tov. Everybody should daven Marav together. Right? You shouldn't read the Megillah anywhere. Send everyone down and clear the cafeteria. Megillah, and then you'll read the Megillah kimo b'chol shana b'shnei makomos, right? And then you'll read the Megillah as everywhere as you do every time else in 2 places, in the Beit Knesset and in the cafeteria. And there'll be a male minyan in each place, and this is better than doing something new like this, right? And then he says, what sounds like what you're saying is that it's more important for the men to hear it than the girls. That's why you say and some of the girls won't hear it by microphone, but the boys, he says, all right, this is nonsense, right? This is eno klum, because women and men are just as obligated, and you have no basis, right? This is just sexism. Therefore, you have to do it in both places as you do every year, and even if you have to wait a little bit until you clear it, no big deal, right? You'll read the Megillah at the same time. Okay, so now we get out of these 3 tshuvot, you develop what I think is a very clear policy for Rav Moshe. Now it's interesting that even though there's at least 28 years taking place between these tshuvot, he never seems to have resolved the underlying issue. Maybe he understands the science better, But even though he understands the science better, that still doesn't clarify his underlying question, which is, what do you do with a sound that is produced by a person in a way that is different than people usually produce sound, but is indistinguishable or even improved acoustically. And so his position is, in general, when you're confronted by new technology and you don't really know what the approach is, let it work out. What I think he's hoping will happen is something like Minhag Yisrael, right? Eventually, the Jewish people will decide there'll be habits, and he has a thumb on the scale because he thinks that we should weight everything towards keeping things the same as opposed to different. At least in America, where people are excessively fond of the novel, it might be that you can imagine another society in which Rav Moshe thinks that people are hide-down traditionalists, and so he'll encourage creativity. I don't know. But he thinks that the job of poskim is to discourage people when asked, to discourage people from objecting when asked, and to make sociological judgments, but not to let those sociological judgments prevent you from doing the right thing in individual cases. So if a woman is in the hospital and she can't hear Havdalah, he'll tell you she can hear Havdalah, and then in case when people want to expand that and say, oh, let's do that in our school in order to save ourselves. In order to save ourselves an hour or half an hour, whatever it takes, before reading Megillah, he says, no. There's some situations where I call it a shas hadchak. This is not enough of a shas hadchak, and that's also a very important thing for poskim to be able to say, you know what, not every shas hadchak is the same. Okay, so now I'm going to stop now and see, are there any questions about Rav Moshe's position?
I have one.
Yep, go ahead, Adina.
Okay, so I guess my question, so where is there a danger of say, or deal with the fact that saying something is allowed in this, our specific situation, and it's relying on, the opinion of Rav Moshe, but since his opinion is actually very nuanced, but then people just hear it's allowed all the time, how is there, or I mean, or maybe they were is there a way to mitigate the fact, to mitigate the, or to convey the nuancy and complexity of the opinion, and how it's we're being very specific and not being very broad.
Yes, I think that's a real challenge. Rav Moshe tried. Obviously, he didn't fully succeed because that person in the girls' school, right, went too far for him. And in a sense, he didn't succeed because there are lots of people using Rav Moshe's tshuva to say that obviously this is the halacha. So I think, I don't know that it's possible. I do think that, for me, it's very important for everyone to understand that Rav Moshe never endorsed it for a deoraisa. And it's important to say that Rav Moshe, objected to using it for even a minor shas hadchak. I think those are all true. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say, look, you know what? It's been 70 years. By now, we should have made up our mind. Right? Right? It was an emerging technology back then. Okay, even in 1980, we could say that that it was an emerging technology. But what about now? But on the other hand, what we can say is that the technology keeps shifting. And this is an argument that I've made in print. I'll keep making it. Is that microphones are not the same things that they were, because now we have digital signal processing. So the notion that something is completely produced by your voice, even then, was not obviously the case, because there's still going to be sound processing. And I don't know. So I imagine, let's say, if you lay Megillah over a hi-fi system which has woofers and subwoofers and tweeters. So so each of them is producing a different voice. So Rav Moshe say, right, they're and they're all somewhat distorted. So would Rav Moshe say, aha, so that's no longer the case? Or we say, who cares? What you hear is the product of all three speakers simultaneously. But now we can do all sorts of things, right? I can, I can stand at a soundboard and I can manipulate you to sound like any number of things. I could put filters on it so that you sound monotonic, or I can put filters on it so that you, so that you're high pitched, or probably by now I could even put a British accent on you. So is that still your voice? Even though your voice can be distorted by so many things in between, and really it's choices being made by the software, and your voice doesn't yield the outdoor result. And then on the other hand, if you say that that a voice which is still clear, but not really similar or easily distinguishable from the original voice is not sufficient. So then you have to deal with not just hearing aids. Now you have to deal with cochlear implants, as cochlear implants don't get the music. Right? They miss all sorts of things. So I think it might be that it might very well be that we should have the right approach to, if we were talking about how we deal with Zoom, and Zoom, right, is really a very similar issue to what Rav Moshe is talking about. So we'd say, like, the right answer is to say, look, let's suppose you're convinced that Zoom can accomplish presence. Let's suppose that you're right. We could argue about that, just like Rav Moshe's interlocutor said it was obvious to him that the sound of the microphone is not the sound. So we could say that it's obvious that that your electronic presence on Zoom is not the same as your your actual presence, and we could do that for a couple of reasons. We could do that because we think that it's not actually a proper reproduction because it's only two-dimensional, and anyone can tell the difference between what they're seeing on a screen, and they see they're framed by a screen, as opposed to seeing the whole person. And then we'll start getting to issues of what happens if it's not miniaturized. What happens if you're looking at it on a 65-inch screen? What happens if you're looking at it on a screen with 3D projection or a curved screen? And I just point out, like, that an issue that I think should have been addressed in the past, but I have not yet found a precedent for, and I'm eager to find a precedent for, is mirrors. Is being seen in the mirror for halachic purposes the same as being seen live. But even if we were to say that you're entirely convinced that your Zoom presence is enough, and what you're thinking about is what happens if it's not if instead of presenting yourself on Zoom exactly as you are, the real question is what happens if I produce an avatar, but the avatar moves like me, right? So we can say everything that appears on screen is the product of my actions. It just happens that I don't look like myself. I look like a giant cat waving my arms around, right? So those are all. Let's suppose that you solve all those. Let's suppose you've solved all those questions, and let's suppose also, that you've solved the delay problem, or you've decided that delay is not the issue. All that matters is whether it's your koach, and we're not, right, either grama is sufficient, or we think the category grama is irrelevant to these purposes. And you don't have a workaround, right? So someone pointed out that by Kriyat Shema, we could have had someone repeat it word for word. Okay, but the shuls that Rav Moshe is objecting to are not shuls where somebody is saying on the microphone, everyone repeats it word for word. Maybe if they had done that, Rav Moshe would have been perfectly happy with it. Okay, we're now in the world of Zoom, right? So I want to apply Rav Moshe. The right answer, it seems to be, is to say that even if you're convinced, which you don't have to be, and lots of people won't be, your proper answer should be, don't, right? But since it's a wholly new idea, don't think about it for D'Oraisas. Don't tell people, don't encourage it. Don't object if people try it, unless you think there's a good sociological reason to object to it. You think that there's a strong slippery slope that people are going to use, once they start using Zoom, they're going to start. There are all sorts of things like this, and this SPM alum Matthew Nitzanim, I think, and I've seen other people do it since, but he was the first one. I said about Megillah, he drew the analogy to the dreaded conservative driving to Shabbat tshuva, and saying, you think you're bringing people in, but actually, what you're doing is you're setting up the possibility that people no longer have to live and share in the same space. And I said to one person that if you actually succeed in creating, in allowing a virtual minyan, all the small shul rabbis across the country are going to have you shot, because you're going to kill all the you're going to kill all the minyanim in small shuls across the country, which are supported by people coming for Kaddish. Right? And so you might have sociological reasons, and you might say, if you could, you'd say, look, for individuals, right? So for individual people who couldn't come to shul because they were quarantined, by all means, you should hear the Megillah by Zoom because it's better than nothing, right? You're right. There's a good chance for you, say. And then the challenge is, what happens if all of a sudden everybody, right? What happens if all of a sudden everybody is able to hear this only by Zoom? So now you have a sociological reason for and a sociological reason against. And in that circumstance, right, I think it's clear. I think the Rav Moshe's model was clear as to what he would have said until then. But now we have a circumstance where there's a mass need, right? Nobody's going to hear Megillah, right? We didn't go into quarantine before Purim. There were lots of people who wouldn't have heard Megillah on Purim, and if it happened now, none of us would be able to do it. So what would Rav Moshe say about Zoom? And we're not talking about Megillah now, because Zoom from Megillah, the only question is, why would you want Zoom? Right? Use a telephone. It's a better thing. What would Rav Moshe say about things that require presence or require minyan? Okay, right. That's the way I want to set up the challenge. And I want to take a few minutes to begin addressing the question of places where what's happening in Halakhah is not the transmission of sound. The transmission of sound is an issue that Rav Moshe dealt with, and we talked about the models, and we talked about that the technology has changed, and so the models might not be exactly applicable, but the theory is still applicable. When it comes to issues of sight, so then it might be that the halachic issues are different, and it might not even be that we would reach that even without the claim that no, I don't really believe that a visual projection is your light presence in the same way that an audio projection is your voice presence, because of the difference between 2 and 3 dimensions. There might be it might be the halachic issues involved are more complex than that. So let's take a look. So you're right. So I think you've probably all seen. Actually, no. Before we take a look at the actual halacha, I think you've probably now all seen, and I hope I didn't put it. Yeah, you've all seen by now. Yeah. So we'll start with Rav Melamed's psak as publicized by Rav Beni Lau, but Lau seems to have done it with great fidelity, because something very much like Rabbi Lau's answer was actually sent as a WhatsApp to the Har Bracha community. So I've given you the Hebrew WhatsApp that was sent out to the Har Bracha community that was sent to me by Eli Fisher, and Rabbi Chai Posner sent to me this morning in English Times of Israel post in which Rabbi Lau essentially translated that WhatsApp and showed that his original presentation was fairly accurate. We'll talk about the one nuance which I'm not sure was obvious in the original newspaper interview. So first of all, background halacha. The Shulchan Aruch says that you say Kaddish, you can only say Kaddish in a standard minyan, right? You can't say with less than 10. Okay. And then he says that one of the criteria of that minyan is Tzarech Shiyu Kol Ha'asara B'makom Echad U'Shliach Tzibur Imahem. Right? So our criteria for minyan for Kaddish are 10, and the 10 have to be defined as being in the same place. Okay, and the shliach tzibur, the person who is reading, who is leading the Kaddish, has to be with them in that same place. Okay, so what did Rabbi Melamed say? Melamed said because of uncertainties about the definition of place. And I'm not sure what his uncertainties are yet. It's a pretty radical statement that it's uncertainty, and about the definition of voice, right, which is Rav Moshe's issue. It is impossible to define gathering in a virtual gathering derech Zoom. So for all purposes of dvarim shebekdusha, would I ask you, is there a minyan or is there not a minyan? The answer is there is not a minyan. Okay, and he makes that clear, by the way, and tells you in number 5, which he says that you can't recite Yud Gimel Midot in a virtual minyan unless you lane them, which you could do biyachid. Now here's an interesting one. He says, Bish'at HaTzorech, in a time of need, Kaddish Yatom v'Kaddish D'Rabanan, Einam Kolim Bracha Levatala. It's not a Bracha Levatala to say Kaddish D'Rabanan and Kaddish Yatom. V'lechein Ha'yitkashrut Elektronit therefore, the electronic connection that can be considered like a minyan. Okay, in Rabbi Lau's translation is they can be considered a kind of minyan. So what does that mean? Right? What on earth does that mean? To be considered a kind of minyan. So what it seems to me is that the proper way to understand Rabbi Malamad's position is that Kaddish Yatom and Kaddish Yachid can be recited biyachid without a violation of bracha levatala, but either because it won't satisfy people, or because that's a really bad precedent if we encourage people to start reciting Kaddish Yatom biyachid and say they don't need a community at all, and they're really not Yotze, because you're not right, because it's in order to be considered a recitation of a Davar Shebek Kedusha, you need a minyan. So we're going to create some kind of zecher. We're going to create something that looks like a minyan because that's better sociologically, and we have a psychological need. Right. So this is a very different kind of policy making. Right. He says is, you know what, this isn't a minyan, and there's I think an unfortunate ambiguity because on the one hand he says sveikot, and the other hand he says unambiguously that you can't consider it a minyan for anything. Now, if it were really a suffix, what he should have said is, in certain kinds of derabbanans we can suggest it works, things like that. So I think that might have been imprecise language. What he means is that there's so many doubts, right? Not that there's a right sveikot shonim. It doesn't mean that there's, that we're not. I'm not sure which it is. What he means, I think, is that there are so many doubts that there's no way you could call this a real minyan. And having concluded that it's not a real minyan, he then says, but there's a way to meet people's psychological needs. But I'm worried about the precedent of the psychological need. And I'm more worried about the precedent of having people say Kaddish to themselves, perhaps, than I am worried about the precedent of a virtual minyan. And that's the position he ends up, is that that a Ka'ain minyan. And that's a really interesting, challenging, and possibly, depending on the community, and not a dangerous strategy. I think that that certainly, the public perception of Rav Malamad's psak is Rav Malamed said you can say Kaddish in a virtual minyan, and what he really says is Rav Malamed says that you can say Kaddish whenever you want. You're not going to be Yotze, but but since you feel bad about it, so I don't mind if you put together a virtual group to feel better about it. But this is the analogy of Nachat Ruach and Nashim by Korbanot, that sometimes this is a good strategy. Sometimes the pastoral need is great enough that you allow a halachic simulacrum. So I think it's really worth a lot of thought about whether Malamad's strategy here is accurate, is viable or not. I want to say one more thing, and we won't have time. If we had time, I would try and put together a more sophisticated argument for an actual virtual minyan in the context of Kaddish that Rabbi Renaud Neuwirth has put together, and my objections to that, and possibly another argument that I might feel better about certain kinds of Kaddishes. I just want to say that so far as I can tell, aside from the policy issues from Melamed, I don't understand the argument halachically. Because while it's true that Kaddish is not a bracha livatala, really what that means is it's not, and he cites evidence, or other people cite evidence, that as opposed to brachot, where there is an objection to saying unnecessary brachot, even if they're in a context which is formally okay, right? Bracha she'ein tzricha, right? So you can take a bite, you can make a bracha, take a bite, make a bracha achrona, make a bracha rishona, take a bite, right? So you can get 100 brachos out of eating one bunch of grapes. But we object to doing that because we think you shouldn't make that many brachot. But we don't object to that with Kaddish. The contemporary custom is we just add another parak of Tehillim, we say another Kaddish. Add another parak of Tehillim, we say another Kaddish. Nobody, in most shuls, people don't say, no, you have to just say all three parakim of Tehillim and then make one Kaddish. That's true. but that's not the same thing as saying that you can say that you can say it in a without a formal justification. And my argument is that saying Kaddish without a minyan is the same thing as making as making a bracha without food. Right? That's a different kind of bracha levatala. Right? It's really what we call a bracha levatala as opposed to bracha she'ein tzricha. So it seems to me that Rav Melama's argument, and I don't understand it. And I emailed his site. I have not gotten a response. I don't really understand the argument fundamentally at all. I think it's so at this stage, although it would be astonishing to me if Rav Melama had overlooked the distinction that obvious. So I might be missing something. At this stage, I think the argument is just wrong, and that you shouldn't be able to do it. But I think there are other arguments that might justify it that I hope I hope will be produced over the next few days, and then we can talk about the policy arguments. Okay, so I want to break here and just stop and take questions either about the specific issue of Kaddish in a in a virtual minyan, or about the right. Really, I guess more. I'd like to take questions about the about the policy questions associated with Rav Melama's notion about whether you should or should not encourage halachic simulacrums in when that's the only way to make people feel, to have people maintain some kind of resonance of the old halakha, or whether the risk that that people will come to mistake it is too great. And I want to put in context, if you have listened or were part of the shir on how radically can halakha change in a shatat chak, you would see that there are models for that in the question of what happens, what are you supposed to do in a year when you can't get a kosher etrog? What are you supposed to do in the years where you can't even get a puzzle etrog? Right, the difference whether you're supposed to carry a dried out lulav, or if you can't find a lulav, you're supposed to carry a plant from a thing from some other kind of plant. Okay, so I will stop and take questions now, and I'll look for another opportunity, I guess, to fully address the question of whether there is a viable argument for saying Kaddish in a minyan, and the questions of whether sight and voice are obviously distinguishable. Okay, so are there further questions?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Adina.
So his public policy issue that Rav Melama discussed was about making people sort of feel better and giving a zeifa or whatever. But since there was an epidemiological report in Israel that of the whatever amount of cases they studied where transmission occurred in Israel, somewhere between 25 and 30% of them happened in a synagogue, is what if we didn't allow this Zoom thing, people would feel like they have to go to synagogue anyway. And then this is the way that allows them to feel that they can stay home, not that they're already going to be staying home, and this makes them feel better.
So I think it's a really good question that came up in the context of Megillah, where I wrote a piece immediately after, arguing that the initial presentation of the psak was a mistake because it said shasatcha kib'diavad dami, and that's really not what the halacha was. It wasn't that it's a b'diavad. It really was, there's this possibility that you're yotzei, not that you're definitely yotzei b'diavad. There's just a possibility that you're yotzei, and better than not, like Rav Moshe about at most like Rav Moshe about Havdalah. And I think a good response to that was, yeah, but if we had said it that way, then too many people would have come to shul. So if we didn't tell people they were definitely yotzei, then we would have had a higher infection rate. I think that is I think that's a real question about how you balance the necessity for halachic nuance and the concern for damage to halacha with the immediate concern. And by the same notion, I think that the language of Ka'ain Minyan is really interesting, because if he didn't use the word Minyan, he just said L'chein mutar lavel lomar kaddish b'kvutza shel chaverav. then it wouldn't work, right? People don't want, right? People would feel it was inauthentic. By saying Ke'en Minyan, right? He runs that possibility. Like I don't know about how much, in the Gemara's original case, how women feel about smicha on the korbanos, if in fact, if somebody were to say every moment, this was the issue that came up with women's tefillah groups, you should know that, right? Whatever you're experiencing, right, is not real, right? It's just, right? We're just letting you do this to make it right because you feel like you want to experience halacha. All right. So Rabbi Lau has a very interesting response to this. Rabbi Lau says that the language of halacha and the language of experience are different, and maybe even though you can't be yotze, maybe there is a lot of value in having a religious value. And right, the reason halacha has meaning is because halacha wants you to have this kind of experience, and now you can't have exactly the experience halacha has, but even if it's not recognized formally, that tells you that there is real value in it, and so there's real value in the religious experience, which halacha just doesn't recognize. That's okay, right? So I think that's a very deep question. That's one, and the questions coming up now, for example, in terms of the Zoom heter for the Zoom heter for the Zoom heter for the Seder. So right. So the obvious question is, on the one hand, right, if you have a standard, right, and almost nobody thinks that there should be a standard that lets you use Zoom no matter what. Everybody thinks there has to be some kind of standard, and most people think that the standard is some kind of risk to mental health. But the problem is, and some people think, let's say Rav Shechter seems to think that the standard is a risk to mental health, or rising to the level of either suicide or at least a psychotic break. But the problem is that many people are in denial. So Rav Shechter's psak, it seems to me, suggests that you require a doctor's note, and that in psychiatric cases, that's not a very practical suggestion unless you want to have a lot of false negatives. There are lots of people who should do this who won't. So the alternative, right? And the problem is, right? There are going to be people who would never do it if you tell them that the only reason they can do it is because they're God forbid it's risk of suicide. So the only way you can get them to do it is by saying that it's okay to do this if if you think there's just a risk that you'll be seriously depressed and lack yontiv. But that, of course, will lead to the question: well, if I can violate this derabanan, let's say, for the sake of simchas yontiv, so what about the many other derabanans that would make my life on yontiv much better? And what's the difference between them? So that, I think, is a very serious public policy consideration we have to engage in now, assuming that the right standard objectively for this is simchat yontiv. There also is, I think many people have pointed out that allowing Zoom for the Seder is probably a very unrealistic model if you think that all you're being matir is just setting up a connection before Yontiv, because Zoom connections time out. Because many things go wrong, and it's probably impractical to allow people to set up pre-existing technology, visual technology, video conferencing technology, and not not expect them to adjust things. And if it's because nefesh, of course they should adjust things. So I don't think we've done a great job so far of producing a coherent public psak. And I think probably what happened was originally the psak was put out privately, and then it became too public. And when it became too public, the formulation that was given publicly was much more cautious than the formulation that was given privately. And now we have confusion all around. And there's some issues we've handled extremely well. I say over and over again that the Rabbinic Council of Bergen County deserves enormous credit for being the nachshon and the vanguard. Frankly, when I first heard their psak, I thought there was a possibility that it was an error, that it was a misreport, and turned out that it was not, and they deserve enormous credit. Now that we see how many people were infected in Israel by Megillah readings, wow, I wish the RCBC had accomplished this earlier. But on the issues of technology, it might be that in the short term we did okay on Megillah, but we haven't come up with, which is just a reflection of our 100-year failure to come up with a coherent response to electricity. The Zoom is an emerging technology, but really, I think we handle bioethics well. and we have handled, I guess, the domestic technology capacities not well for 100 years now, and it makes a real difference. Like, whether halacha does something well on the whole or does something not well. Okay, are there other questions? Okay, as always, you're welcome to email me privately with questions or ask for time to talk. And I hope that we'll get to welcome you at the shurim for the rest of the week. And we'll please stay tuned for notices about next week. Thank you very much.